The first piece we're looking at, or the first structure we're looking at in the New Kingdom, is the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut. Now, Hatshepsut is one of 3 queens of Egypt, a female pharaoh. They're not really queens, they're female pharaohs. I won't get into that too much. Now, she wasn't actually the ruler. There's a boy by the name of Thutmose III, her son, who is extremely young when his father dies. So he becomes pharaoh, but Hatshepsut is working as his regent. In other words, making all of the decisions until Thutmose can reach the age of majority. In other words, reach adulthood. Later, she will proclaim herself the rightful pharaoh. And basically, she does this by slowly taking little bits of power here and there until eventually having herself declared pharaoh. Unfortunately, she doesn't kill her son, which means later on her son will have her killed and become pharaoh. So he does get there eventually. And by the way, there's a misunderstanding. People think that Hatshepsut was trying to hide the fact that she's female. We'll see she in fact was not. That has more to do with the symbolism of the pharaoh than it does trying to hide one's femininity. So what we're looking at here is her mortuary temple. Now, this is not where she's buried. She's actually buried on the other side of this rock outcropping. And really by outcropping, I mean fairly large cliffs and a mountain. But on the other side of it is the Valley of the Kings. So this is that public mortuary temple that we've seen from the Step Pyramid of Djoser and the Great Pyramids, a larger version of that, since the public is not allowed into the Valley of the Kings. And this features some interesting ideas. First of all, we have 3 terraces laid out. So there are 3 levels to this, each colonnaded. So in other words, we have a series of columns running along each terrace. So they're colonnaded terraces. And we get this very rhythmic pattern from the repetition of light and dark from the columns next to the dark spaces between them. And the terraces would have been covered with lush foliage. This is a little better view of sort of how it's laid out. And that would have been very interesting because the foliage is going to be brought in and artificially grown in the desert. This is in the desert. This is in the Red Land. And that foliage is being brought from near the Red Sea. It's going to be palm trees and tropical things, and that's going to take a lot of resources, but it's also a way to show her power. The interior is decorated with painted murals carved in low relief. So they're carved and then they're painted. Very, very common in Egypt. A lot of times we see unpainted murals and we think, oh, it was just carved. But in reality, what happens with a lot of these tombs and structures is as soon as it's opened up, if it hasn't been opened like Hatshepsut's mortuary temple here, if it's just been opened up, the difference between the very dry air that's inside of it and the slightly moister air and different temperatures and slightly different atmospheric conditions means that most of the time when we open a tomb, the paint will simply flake off within 48 hours. And we see that with other structures and other artistic pieces, such as the terracotta army in China. When that was unearthed, the same thing happened. So not only are there murals, but they're going to be sculptures. In fact, there's over 200 sculptures in the round. And when we say there's 200 that survive, what we mean is there are 200 that we have bits and pieces of, or that we've put back together. Because her son, when he becomes emperor, tries to wipe her from history by having her name carved out of everything that he can find, having all of her statues destroyed, etc. Not that he holds a grudge. And here we're seeing Hatshepsut with offering jars, making an offering to the sun god. And these offering jars would have contained, for example, oil and wine or honey or whatever else. Now, when you look at her physical appearance, it appears to be your standard male pharaoh. But what are we looking for there? We're looking for symbols of strength. We're looking for The beard, which is never a beard, it's actually a prosthetic piece that they would wear on their chin. The headdress, again, we associate that with the male pharaohs. But she's not trying to hide herself. These are all symbols of Pharaoh's power. The lack of breasts are because she's being idealized into sort of a male form. Again, that's because Horus is thought of as a male god, and then she, if she is Horus, must take that form. So this is mostly symbolic. Anyone in Egypt at the time would have known Hatshepsut is a woman, because everyone in the royal palace and everyone associated with her or who had ever seen her would know. So she's not trying to hide anything here. She would also be famous for one other thing. She'll reintroduce the festival of drunkenness. This is pointless trivia, but it's kind of fun. The festival of drunkenness meant that the Egyptian government paid for your beer. The idea was to go to the local city. You would get as drunk as possible on free beer. And this is a sacrifice to a god. The sacrifice comes in a little bit. And this was a time of sort of free love and drunkenness, for lack of a better term. Then everyone passes out, because that's kind of what happens at that point. And then a few hours later, they come through the streets beating the loudest drums you can imagine. That waking up, that suffering with a hangover and the drums going off is the sacrifice to the earth god, stopping him from destroying the earth for one more year. So it's a sacrifice of pain. We see the same thing in other cultures, although oftentimes it's a lot more physical, involving bloodletting or something like that.